Okay, today we're looking at Mariah Carey, If It's Over on SNL. And I've been told to get a bib for my brain as it splatters everywhere. Cue the logo. Oh. So this is something that I tell a lot of people, whoops, there's logo again. I can't just, I have to self-promote. But what I hear from a lot of singers when they go down, they try to shove the tongue back. And while that does lower the larynx, it tends to make a very unattractive sound. But what we're seeing from Mariah is that she's going down and it's getting a little breathy, but that's fine. She's using a brighter vowel. She's keeping that tongue forward. And because of that, it is a more present sound. And you get the added benefit of that little breathiness. And it's a cool sound. It's a great texture and it doesn't sound like, oh. That's the technical term, by the way. Right there. That is a small thing, but it's a really good thing.
Won't you talk to me? This is so out of hand.
Nice. A lot going on with the vowels here. She's going from bright ah, right, with retracted lips, and then she's also introducing a little bit of a pursed lip. And this might sound tiny, like a little difference here and there, but it fundamentally changes the tone that we're hearing. Let's cue the scientist.
And you can see here slices all the way from roughly where the trachea begins. Here's where the vocal folds would be, and out here's the mouth.
You presumably have to change the shape of this as it's
Dynamically,
yeah.
Several times a second. Here's an example of what we would do to change the shape in a simple construct like ya, 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 ya. Ya, 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 ya.
So what you can see there is that this is effectively the mouth. And so if it's becoming wider, wider like this, it's ultimately shortening the vocal tract, which makes for a highlighting of higher frequency. Now, this is a spectrogram. It's going to be frequencies on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis, and the brightness of the blue determines or denotes how loud that frequency is. Let's just give it a roll here. So you can see that as my lips are pursing or getting wider, what we're seeing is that those higher frequencies become more pronounced. And so by doing that within a phrase, we get a lovely little bit of dynamic contrast during the phrase. And I say that that's pretty nice. So there's a couple of really cool things happening right here. Whenever you do a run, you really run the risk of being just kind of mush, right? Right? That's kind of like not interesting. And the primary reason I would say that that's not interesting is because there's no respect to the meter. In meter, 1, 2, 3, 4, different beats get different emphasis. Sorry, I still think the emphasis on the wrong syllable is funny. So one of the ways that she is highlighting certain notes versus others is by changing the vowels. And the other thing you can see too is that she's like moving her jaw very suddenly, right? Right? And that does change the tone. one other thing to note too is that as she's in the middle of the sustaining the note, she no longer has vibrato, and this is significant because it has everything to do with how thick and tolerant the vocal folds are to outside. How would you put those? When you move the body with the folds, right, the sound gets influenced, and so that's kind of what's happening here with the jaw. Now this piece of cartilage right here is called the thyroid cartilage, and it's basically an Adam's apple, right? This little part of it is what creates the protrusion that we know as the Adam's apple. Now, as we can see, these are the vocal folds, and they're actually connected to the thyroid cartilage, which means when you tilt the thyroid cartilage, you'll see motion there. And what that does when I tilt that piece of cartilage, it stretches out the folds, and so they're less kind of movable. So if I do or you can see that as I kind of touch my throat when it's tilted, there's less variation. It doesn't move as much. That makes sense, right? When I tilt, I get that stretching, it's harder to move sort of thing. And so what Mariah is doing, and I think this is super cool, is she is going from tilted to untilted in order to add warmth and vibrato to the phrase, but then she'll untilt when she wants to give a note a little emphasis with the jaw movement. Super clever, super specific. Let's listen to it again because it's so cool. So it's a very small thing, but it's what makes a run intelligible. Nice. Ooh, how about those singers in the back? How about those singers right there? One thing I really respect about Mariah is not just her abilities, but her pragmatic decision making and in terms of who she surrounds herself with. As a musician, she really wants the best, and so what we get is the best, right? These backup singers are probably some of the best in the business. Listen to the sound.
And it seems like you've changed.
It's a beautiful blend. The harmonies are perfectly tuned, and they do it right at the start of the very first note. That's how good these people are.
In so many ways.
Nice.
Oh, it is unfair. It is unright. If it's really good.
Wow, the way that she's working with the instrumentation and the arrangement is absolutely stellar. Listen to how the guitar comes in when she hits that low note. There we go. Right? That's super cool. The guitar is really there with her. And the guitar adds some distortion, and then she adds a little bit more power. Nice rasp. Oh, oof! Look at the backup singer. These exaggerated vowels really do the same thing we talked about before. Really changes the tone. Right? Very, very different. I love how the horns come in as well right here. right? They come in and then they cut out a little bit, and I love that. This arrangement is so, so, so dynamic. It's incredible.
Won't you speak to me? I'm just here holding on. I'm just holding on. 'Cause baby, I really don't need to any longer. Oh no, if the feeling is gone.
I really love, she's so specific with her phrasing, and this is true of all the great singers, is that every phrase ends up being very special because it's so distinct from the others. Watch how in the span of like 3 to 4 seconds, she changes how she hits the higher notes, dramatically changes them. So let's give it a listen.
Really don't need to any longer. Oh no. It is unfair.
So we have here is a belt that she kind of just tosses, which is not a bad thing. It's like, hey, right? Kind of more of like a calling.
It is alright. 'Cause if it's really gone, then tell me tonight, baby. Yeah. If it's over.
Right, like, and then she's doing the same throwaway thing, over, right? But she's adding a rasp.
If it's over.
And then she adds some distortion by making the false folds kind of hit each other a little bit. One of the things that's very important to talk about is that the false fold thing that she did is actually quite difficult, and here's why. These false folds are very large, about double the size, if not more, than the actual vocal folds themselves, which are right below it. Right here, these are the true folds, right? So the false vocal folds are very, very large, and more importantly, they have a larger surface area, so that divides all of the pressure of putting them together across a larger surface area, which means they can take more abuse. And so while that's great for raspiness, what we also see here is that when these false folds come together, they end up really tightening the vocal tract. You can kind of see it here. There's a kind of a squeezing that would have happened if these things came together. And so this makes higher notes very, very much, like a lot more difficult. When it comes to higher notes, you already need much less air, but because this is so inefficient and not ergonomic at all, we need to use even less air and be even more technical. So rasps sound simple, but they're very precise in order to be able to accomplish this. Very, very precise. Nice. I love here what she's doing where she's not necessarily sustaining those higher notes. It very much gives it its own kind of style, right? So instead of this, ah, right? Very classical and vibrato, right? Straight tone and vibrato. So we get that, and then we get this, oh, oh, right? And what that communicates is much different than the straight sound, right? The holding of the note is very much its own aesthetic. I love this little thing. So at the tail end of the notes, what you're hearing is the right, that aspirate sound. That aspirate sound is created by the vocal folds separating. And what she's doing is she's separating it very suddenly after the note. And so what we get from that is a kind of a it's like a percussive little finish at the end of that note. And it's super, super specific. It has a very distinct sound. Ooh. I love this. So what we have here are two different onsets. So what is an onset? An onset is the beginning of a note. And we're hearing a couple different onsets. Let's go through some of the ways that you can start a note when you're... Now, when we're looking at this graph, this is actually going to be significantly easier than other times we've looked at it. We're just going to look at the waveform right here. So this is called an aspirate abrupt. And the reason why we can identify it as an abrupt via the waveform is because it starts out pretty flat. And I don't mean the pitch. I mean, look at this. It's almost like a straight line right here. And that's definitely more true the more you look at it and little zoom out. You see that? It's just kind of like a... Now, the reason why this happens with the vocal folds is a principle called the Bernoulli effect. Don't worry, we're going to make it real simple. With the Bernoulli effect, we're looking at the vocal folds coming together through air, and I'm having a hard time here, but here we go. You see how when I blow air, the papers come together a little bit, right? And that's the Bernoulli effect. By putting air through that paper, I'm changing the difference between the pressure that's outside of the pieces of paper versus between the pieces of paper. I am pushing out the pressure in between, and so the pressure outside is greater and therefore compress the pieces of paper, and this is exactly how the vocal folds work. And so an aspirate abrupt happens when I whoop. There we go. Okay. The aspirate abrupt happens when I'm adding a lot of air, and then all of a sudden, boom, the vocal folds come together. And this is what this sounds like when it's... You hear that? It's very, very specific. Let's look at it a little more closely. Right? It's got its own... So the next sound we're going to talk about is the glottal stop. I guess in this case, the glottal stop. Now, a glottal happens when you... basically hold your breath, and then you make sound, right? And so you don't get that airy beginning because no air is being allowed through or in between the vocal folds. Now you can use this to get a little bit more of a percussive on. So here it is. We're going to hear it right on the word if. It's. Right? So on that if, you get a little bit of a right? And so that's a glottal. But wait, there's more. So when we were talking about rasp on the high notes, we were talking about the false folds coming together and adding a little rasp. Now that's quite a bit different than the growling that we're about to hear. So that's the rasp. And that is the growl. Now, these are using different parts of the body. Well, they still use the false folds, but differently. Let's give it a look. So, pardon the resolution, video MRIs are generally just super hard to do live, so they have extremely low resolution. What you're seeing right there, what I'm circling right there, is called the epiglottis. And the role of the epiglottis is to prevent you from inhaling food or inhaling water. It's a very large piece of cartilage that will go on top of the esophagus. I think that's right? The esophagus. I swear I know what it is. So this right here, that is the epiglottis. Now the way that this works is that the epiglottis, you push it down a tiny bit using the root of the tongue. Now, it's worth mentioning that you don't want to push your tongue too far down. Otherwise, it kind of makes it more difficult and a lot more swallowed of a... So while the epiglottis goes down and back here, you end up having the false folds kind of rattling on top of the epiglottis. And so it's like a drummer and a drum, right? In this case, the epiglottis is the drum, and the false fold is the drummer. And so you get a sound that's loud down on me. Yeah. Right? Kind of very Louis Armstrong.
It's for your honesty. Won't you give it to me? Give it to me now.
Right? Now, what I love about this is she's using a brighter vowel in combination with the growl. And so that minimizes that swallowed effect that you get when you push the root of the tongue down in order to accomplish getting the epiglottis in that spot where it's next to the false fold.
It's all baby, if it's so.
Nice. Ooh, okay, yes.
Let me go.
Wow. There's so much that goes on in every single phrase with her. It's really, really great. It's just everything we've talked about here is happening in this tail end here.
Let me go.
Nice. Yes, cool. And that's why Mariah Carey is Mariah Carey. Thank you all for the suggestion to watch this. This is an incredible performance. I appreciate your faces. I cover a lot of Mariah on the channel, and sometimes I ask people what performances they would like to see from me. So you can put your 2 cents in and what performance recommendations that you want, either by subscribing and then you'll see the post where I ask for those suggestions, or you simply look up on the community tab on my page and you can scroll and find those threads. Anyway, I'm glad I could talk to you all through the science of singing. I like when science is